Moving into a quiet suburb had been my husband Josh's idea. "It's peaceful here," he'd said, pointing to the tree-lined streets and neatly mowed lawns when we first toured the area. I had reluctantly agreed, even though the slower pace of life felt stifling at times. The most exciting thing to happen around here was a new neighbor moving in, and that's exactly what happened last week. I first noticed him unloading a U-Haul late one Sunday afternoon. From our kitchen window, I watched as he carried boxes inside, his movements swift and efficient. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall with an athletic build and a scruffy beard that gave him an air of ruggedness. "Looks like someone finally bought the Andersons' place," I said to Josh, who was focused on his laptop at the dining table. "Good for them," he mumbled, barely looking up. Typical Josh. The next day, I decided to introduce myself. It felt neighborly, and, if I was being honest, I was curious. I threw on a casual sundress, telling myself it was just to look presentable. As I walked across the lawn, he was kneeling by the flower bed near the porch, wrestling with a tangle of weeds. He glanced up when he heard me approach, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Hi there," I called out, putting on my friendliest smile. "I'm Sarah. I live next door with my husband, Josh." He stood and extended his hand. "Daniel," he said, his grip firm. "Nice to meet you, Sarah." I couldn't help but notice his smile. It was warm, genuine, and something about it made my chest tighten just a little. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I said, feeling slightly flustered. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to knock. We're right there." I pointed to our house. "Thanks. I appreciate that." His gaze lingered for a beat longer than necessary before he turned back to his weeds. The encounter was brief but left me oddly energized. For the first time in months, I caught myself humming as I folded laundry later that evening. Over the next week, I saw Daniel a few more times. At first, it was little things: a wave as he drove by, a polite nod while walking his dog. But there was something in his demeanor that made those moments feel significant. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, I was a married woman in a steady, if uneventful, marriage. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Josh snored softly beside me, I couldn't help but replay the way Daniel had smiled when he said my name. I wasn't looking for reasons to run into Daniel, but it started happening more often than seemed accidental. One morning, I bumped into him at the mailbox. He was wearing a gray hoodie and jogging shorts, his face slightly flushed from a run. "Morning, Sarah," he greeted me, flashing that same warm smile. "Morning," I replied, clutching the pile of mail in my hands as if it were a lifeline. "Getting your cardio in early?" "Trying to keep up with life," he joked, leaning casually against the post. "What about you? Early riser or just escaping the house for a bit?" I laughed nervously. "A bit of both. Some mornings I just need a break from staring at the same four walls, you know." His expression softened. "I get that. It's nice to step out and breathe for a while." The conversation didn't last long, but as I walked back to the house, I realized I was smiling. It was strange how easily he could lift my mood with a few words. As the days went on, our interactions grew longer and more personal. He shared bits of his life: how he'd moved to escape the memories of his divorce, how he was trying to start fresh. In return, I found myself opening up more than I should have. One afternoon, we found ourselves in line at the local grocery store. "Small world," I said, when I noticed him behind me, holding a basket with a carton of eggs and a six-pack of beer. "Or maybe this town is just that tiny," he replied with a chuckle. "What's on your menu tonight?" "Pasta," I said, glancing at my cart. "Josh is obsessed with spaghetti, so, again." "Lucky guy," he said, his tone light, but his eyes saying something else entirely. I laughed, but the compliment lingered longer than I wanted it to. By the time I got home, my thoughts were swirling. Was I overthinking things? Or was there something unspoken in the way Daniel looked at me, the way he seemed to genuinely listen when we talked? That night, Josh was glued to his phone, scrolling through sports highlights during dinner. I stared at the plate of spaghetti between us, trying to ignore the growing gap I felt. "Everything okay?" I asked after a long silence. Yeah, fine, he said without looking up. I nodded, biting my lip. Everything wasn't fine, but it was easier to pretend it was. Later, as I cleaned the dishes, I glanced out the window. Daniel's kitchen light was on. He was standing by the sink, drinking a glass of water. For a moment, his gaze shifted toward our house. I stepped back quickly, heart racing, as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. But deep down, I knew it wasn't guilt I felt. It was something far more complicated. Josh had a last-minute work trip that weekend, leaving me alone in the house for 2 full days. Normally, I'd welcome the solitude, a chance to binge-watch bad TV and order takeout without judgment. But this time, the quiet felt heavier than usual. It was Saturday evening, and I was halfway through cleaning up dinner when I heard a knock at the door. Wiping my hands on a dish towel, I opened it to find Daniel standing there, holding a toolbox. "Hey," he said, gesturing toward my dimly lit porch. "Your front light's been flickering. Thought I'd see if I could help fix it." I hesitated. It wasn't exactly late, but it wasn't early either. Still, his smile was disarming, and the thought of someone caring enough to notice the small things caught me off guard. "Oh, sure," I said, stepping aside. "Thanks, I didn't even realize." He made quick work of the repair, his hands deftly tightening bolts and replacing the bulb. I stood by, awkwardly holding the flashlight he'd asked for. "There we go," he said finally, flipping the switch. The porch lit up with a steady glow. "Wow, you're handy," I said, smiling. He shrugged. "Spent enough years fixing things in my own house. Guess I've got the hang of it." We lingered on the porch for a moment longer than necessary. I was about to thank him again and retreat inside when he said, "You don't have to spend the night cooped up alone, you know." I froze, unsure how to respond. "Oh, I'm fine, just a quiet night for me." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Sometimes quiet can be lonely. There was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. "I should let you get back inside," he said, his tone softening. But as he turned to leave, I surprised myself. "Wait," I blurted out. "Do you want a coffee? I mean, since you're already here?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure. Why not?" We sat in the kitchen, mugs in hand, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his ex-wife, how their relationship had slowly unraveled over the years. "It's like we just stopped seeing each other," he said, staring into his cup. "She'd be in the same room, but it felt like she was a million miles away." I swallowed hard, his words hitting closer to home than I wanted to admit. "I guess that happens sometimes." He looked up at me then, his gaze steady. "Does it?" The question hung in the air, charged with an intensity that made me feel exposed. I laughed nervously, breaking eye contact. "I should, check the time. Don't want to keep you too late." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for the coffee, Sarah." As he stood to leave, I walked him to the door, my heart pounding. When he stepped out onto the porch, he paused. "Good night," he said, his voice low. "Good night," I whispered, closing the door behind him. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the handle, wondering what I was doing. By the following week, I convinced myself that my conversation with Daniel had been harmless. But the truth gnawed at me every time I passed his house or caught a glimpse of him walking his dog. I tried to shake the thoughts. I went to the gym after work, hoping that a good sweat would clear my head. It worked for a while, until I stepped out of the locker room and nearly walked into Daniel. "Sarah?" His surprise mirrored my own. "Daniel," I said, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you, I guess." He held up a water bottle. "Trying to stay in shape." We chatted briefly in the lobby, the conversation light, but charged with an undertone I couldn't ignore. As I gathered my things to leave, he said, "Hey, you hungry? There's a diner down the street. My treat." I hesitated, but the thought of going home to an empty house wasn't appealing. "Sure," I said before I could talk myself out of it. The diner was small and cozy, its booths lined with faded vinyl. We slid into a corner table, and for the next hour we talked like old friends. He asked about my life, my dreams, things Josh hadn't asked about in years. At one point, I caught myself laughing at a story he was telling about his college days. It felt good. Too good. You know, he said, leaning back in the booth, I wasn't sure what to expect when I moved here. But meeting you? That's been a nice surprise. I froze, unsure how to respond. He must have noticed my discomfort because he quickly added, Sorry. That probably came out wrong. I just mean, you're easy to talk to. I nodded, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. You too. We finished our meals and stepped outside into the cool night air. As we stood by my car, he turned to me. Sarah, can I be honest? I met his gaze, my heart pounding. Of course. I've felt a connection with you since the day we met. I know you're married, and I respect that. But. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I can't pretend I don't feel something when I'm around you. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Daniel, I started, but I didn't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said, his voice soft. I just needed you to know. He took a step back, giving me space. Good night, Sarah. Good night, I whispered, watching as he walked away. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. His words echoed in my mind, stirring emotions I didn't want to confront. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house felt colder, emptier than before. It was late when I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. At first I thought I'd imagined it. I sat up on the couch, the TV casting faint blue light across the room. But then it came again, insistent but quiet. I pulled back the curtain and saw Daniel standing there in the darkness, his face barely visible under the porch light. I opened the window cautiously. Daniel, what are you doing here? I saw the light on, he said, his voice low. I thought maybe you couldn't sleep. I hesitated, torn between irritation and something I didn't want to name. It's late. I know, he said. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I said to you the other night. I needed to explain. Daniel, I started, but he held up a hand. Just hear me out, he pleaded. I'm not trying to complicate your life, Sarah. I can't keep this to myself anymore. You're the first person I've felt alive with in a long time. And I know you probably think I'm crazy for showing up like this, but. He trailed off, his eyes searching mine. You're not crazy, I said, surprising even myself. But this, whatever this is, it's not fair to anyone. He nodded slowly, but his gaze didn't waver. You're right. It's not fair. But when I see you, when I talk to you, it feels like the one thing in my life that makes sense. I gripped the edge of the window, my emotions warring with my better judgment. Daniel, I can't. I'm not asking for anything, he interrupted. I just needed you to know how I feel. That's all. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then he stepped back, his hands in his pockets. Good night, Sarah. I closed the window, my heart hammering in my chest. As I turned away, I caught my reflection in the glass. The look in my eyes was unmistakable. Confusion, longing, and fear all mixed together. I turned off the light and climbed the stairs to my bedroom. But sleep didn't come easily. His words played on a loop in my mind, making it impossible to ignore the growing crack in the foundation of my carefully constructed life.